Put the gloves on, old lady, unless you're scared. The words landed hard across the parking lot of Callahan Motor Works. Derek Vaughn stood center stage in his own little theater, training gloves on his hands, black belt pride wrapped around every inch of him. His friends had their phones up. His father stood back with his arms crossed and a smile that said he already knew how this ended. Ray Callahan stood opposite him, blonde ponytail, grease on her shirt, no gloves, no expression, and not one single step backward. If you're watching this right now, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me all the way to the end, because what happens next is something nobody in that parking lot was ready for. The morning had started the way most Saturdays started at Callahan Motor Works, with coffee going cold on the workbench and Megan already complaining about it. "You made this 40 minutes ago," Megan said, lifting the mug and making a face. "You could pave a road with this." "Then don't drink it," Ray said, without looking up from the carburetor she was cleaning. "I'm going to drink it. That's not the point." Megan took a long sip, grimaced, and set it back down. "The point is you need to stop starting things you don't finish." Ray glanced at her sister. "I finish everything I start." Megan raised an eyebrow and gestured at the half-painted fence along the north side of the property. Ray went back to the carburetor. That was most mornings. That was the texture of their life, comfortable, familiar, a little worn at the edges in ways that felt more like home than anything pristine ever could. The garage had been their father's. After he passed, it became theirs. Megan handled the front office, the phones, the scheduling, and what she called keeping Ray from accidentally scaring customers with her face. Ray handled everything that involved getting her hands dirty, which was most of the actual work. By 9 in the morning, 3 vehicles were already up on lifts. By 9:30, 2 more had pulled in. By 10, the parking lot was starting to fill up with early arrivals for the charity event, a fundraiser Ray organized every year, raising money for injured veterans and working families in the area who couldn't always cover the gap between what they had and what they needed. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't a gala with a dress code. It was folding tables, donated food, a raffle with decent prizes, and the kind of people who showed up because they wanted to, not because they needed to be seen doing it. The morning felt good. The kind of good that makes you suspicious in retrospect, because you realize later it was the last quiet before everything came apart. Derek Vaughn arrived at 10:45. He didn't pull into the lot quietly. That wasn't his style. He came in fast, cut the wheel sharp, and parked his car in a way that took up space belonging to 2 other vehicles. He was 23 years old and built like someone who spent a lot of time in front of mirrors. He wore his black belt like other men wore expensive watches, not as something useful, but as a signal, as a declaration. He wanted you to know what he was before he said a single word. He had a group with him. 4 friends who moved in his orbit the way smaller objects move around stronger gravity, not entirely by choice, more by habit and mild intimidation. They already had their phones out. Megan was at the front table, setting up the registration materials for the fundraiser, when Derek walked up and stood over the table with his arms crossed. "Where's your sister?" he asked. Megan looked up at him. She had learned to keep her voice flat with Derek because anything warmer gave him something to work with. "Busy. Tell her I need to talk to her. She's with a customer." Derek looked around at the lot with the expression of someone taking inventory of things that didn't belong to them. "This the Liltel charity thing?" "It is. Cute." He picked up one of the informational flyers from the table and looked at it for 3 seconds before setting it back down the wrong way. "Who's it for?" "Veterans. Families in need," he nodded slowly, the way people nod when they're not actually listening. "She make much money off this?" Megan kept her voice level. "That's not how fundraisers work." He smiled at that, the way someone smiles when they think the other person has just said something naive. "Everything's how someone makes money. You're just not seeing who." He looked at her registration sheet. "What's all this?" "Please don't touch that." He touched it anyway. Not maliciously, not yet, just with the casual indifference of someone who had spent his entire life touching things that didn't belong to him because no one had ever made it cost him anything. Megan reached across and straightened the sheet. I asked you not to do that. Derek looked at her for a moment. Then he smiled again, wider this time. You're feisty. I like that. He looked over at his friends. She's feisty. His friends laughed. Ray appeared around the side of the building, wiping her hands on a shop rag. She'd seen Derek's car come in from inside the garage. She didn't hurry. She didn't look alarmed. She walked at the same pace she always walked, deliberate, even, like someone who understood that rushing toward trouble rarely improved the outcome. Derek, she said. He turned. There she is. What can I do for you? I was just getting to know your sister. He looked back at Megan. She's got a little attitude. She asked you not to touch her materials, Ray said. That's not attitude. That's a reasonable request. Derek turned fully to face Ray. He was taller than her by a good 5 inches, and he used every one of them. You always this uptight? I'm always this direct. There's a difference. She glanced at the parking spot he'd taken. You're across 2 spaces. There are people coming in this morning who need to park. I'll move when I'm ready. You'll move now, or I'll have it towed. His friends went quiet. That was the kind of silence that happens when someone says something in public that shifts the balance of the room. Derek blinked. People didn't tell him to move his car. People made suggestions. They asked nicely. They backed down when he didn't respond. Ray looked at him without hostility and without apology and waited. He moved the car. He didn't say anything when he got back. He just stood at the edge of the registration table with his jaw tight, watching Ray go back to the garage. And his friends were careful not to make eye contact with him for the next several minutes because they knew what that look meant. That was the first exchange. It wouldn't be the last. Around 11:15, one of the customer motorcycles, a beautiful older Harley belonging to a man named Frank Delacroix, a Vietnam veteran who'd been bringing his bike to Callahan Motor Works for 11 years, came down off its lift so Ray could give it a final inspection before Frank arrived to pick it up. Frank always showed up early. He liked to watch the last few minutes of the work. He said it made him feel like the bike was being handed back to him properly, like a transfer of care. Derek had been wandering the lot for the better part of an hour. He'd eaten twice from the food table without donating anything, talked loudly about his tournament record to anyone within earshot, and demonstrated a jump kick near a group of older attendees who had not asked for a demonstration. One of the older women flinched. Derek found that funny. Ray had been watching him at intervals, not constantly, not with the focused attention of someone waiting for a confrontation. More the way you watch a loose piece of equipment in a workspace, something that isn't threatening yet, but has the potential to cause damage if you stop paying attention entirely. At 11:20, she heard Megan's voice change. Ray couldn't hear the words from inside the garage. She'd known her sister's voice for 38 years, and she knew the difference between the way Megan sounded when she was irritated and the way she sounded when she was actually upset. What came through the open bay door was the second one. She set down her wrench. When she came around the corner, she saw Derek standing behind the parts display that Megan had set up along the side of the building. He had his hand on the back of Megan's arm, not grabbing, not yet, but holding. Megan was turned slightly, trying to move without making it worse. Tell her, Derek was saying. Tell her what you saw. I didn't see anything, Megan said. You're lying. Let go of her arm, Ray said. Derek looked up. He released Megan's arm and stepped back, spreading his hands like a man demonstrating he'd done nothing wrong. We were just talking. You had your hand on her. That's not talking. She was walking away from a conversation. Megan moved toward Ray. Her face was controlled, but her hands weren't quite steady, and Ray noticed that. She filed it. The mirror on Frank Delacroix's motorcycle, Ray said. She'd heard the tail end of it when she was coming around. What happened to it? Derek's expression shifted slightly. Accident. I bumped it. It was fine this morning. Things break. That's life. His left mirror is cracked. Then fix it. Send him a bill. Whatever. The bill won't go to him, Ray said. He's a customer, and he trusted us with his vehicle. The bill goes to you." Derek looked at her. The easy posture didn't change, but something behind his eyes hardened. "That's funny. I don't mean it to be. You know who my father is? I know who your father is. Then you know how this works." Ray looked at him steadily. "No. Tell me how this works." He hadn't expected her to say that. He'd expected either backing down or escalation. She'd given him something in between that he didn't quite know how to process. "My father handles things. That's all." "Your father can call me," Ray said. "We can talk about the mirror. We can talk about the property damage from last week. We can talk about several other things that have been documented." She paused. "Or you can make this uglier than it needs to be." Something shifted in his face. "You threatening me? I'm giving you information. What you do with it is your choice." He stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned and walked away. His friends fell in beside him, and Ray heard him say something in a low voice she couldn't make out, and then one of them laughed. Megan exhaled slowly beside her. "He cracked the mirror on purpose," she said. "I was watching him. He leaned against it. I know. He lied to your face. I know. And you just let him walk away." Ray picked up the shop rag from her back pocket and wiped her hands even though they were already clean. He didn't walk away. He walked towards something he's going to regret. She glanced at her sister. "Are you all right?" Megan straightened her sleeve where Derek had held her arm. "I'm fine. You sure?" "I said I'm fine, Ray." Ray nodded. She knew better than to push. Richard Vaughn arrived 20 minutes later. He drove a large silver SUV, the kind of vehicle that suggests a man who wants to be seen making decisions. He parked it properly this time because he had seen what happened to Derek's car, and Richard Vaughn did not like being told where to put things. But he was also smart enough to know when to pick his fights. He was 56. He had the hands of someone who'd done physical work early in life, and the posture of someone who'd spent the last 20 years paying other people to do instead. His face was the kind of face that had probably been handsome once and was now mostly powerful looking, which he seemed to find acceptable. Derek met him at the edge of the lot. Ray watched them from the garage doorway. She couldn't hear what they were saying. She could read the body language easily enough. Derek's hands were moving. Richard's weren't. Richard was doing what Richard always did, listening, absorbing, calculating. Then he put his hand on Derek's shoulder and said something brief, and Derek nodded. Then Richard looked across the lot at Ray. She didn't look away. He smiled. She still didn't look away. The smile faded. He walked toward her. "Miss Callahan," he said. "Mr. Vaughn, my son tells me there was an incident. Your son damaged a customer's motorcycle and grabbed my sister's arm." Richard's expression didn't change. "Boys get animated sometimes. It doesn't mean anything. A man in his 20s grabbing a woman's arm means something. Nobody got hurt. That's not the bar." Richard looked past her into the garage. "You've got a good little operation here," he said. It was the tone of a man who was technically complimenting you while structurally diminishing you. "A good little operation. I'd hate to see things become complicated. Then tell your son to stop creating complications." Richard's voice stayed smooth. "I'm going to tell you something. Woman to man, I say that. With respect, you don't need to explain the phrase. My son has been training for 8 years. He's got a legitimate black belt from a legitimate school. He's not someone to make an enemy of." Ray looked at him. "Is that a warning?" "That's information." She recognized what he'd done because she'd just done the same thing to Derek 15 minutes ago. The difference was she'd meant hers honestly. Richard meant his as a threat wrapped in plausible deniability. "Mr. Vaughn," she said, "I've been running this garage for 14 years. I've dealt with difficult customers, difficult suppliers, difficult neighbors, and difficult men who believed their difficulty was a kind of power. Your son damaged a customer's property and put his hand on my sister. I'll be billing you for the mirror repair. If there's a next time, I'll be calling the police before I call you." Richard studied her for a moment. "You're a brave woman," he said. "I'm a direct one," she answered. "There's a difference." He turned and walked back to his son. Ray watched him go. She heard him say something to Derek as he reached him. Something short. Derek's jaw tightened. He looked across the lot at Ray with an expression she recognized, not anger exactly. Not yet, but the particular humiliation of a young man who has just watched someone else refuse to be afraid of him. That expression was the one she'd been worried about all morning. For the next 30 minutes, the fundraiser operated normally. People arrived. Music played from a small speaker someone had brought. Kids ran between cars. Veterans gathered near the far table where Grizzly's crew was supposed to set up. Eventually, the Hells Angels contingent ran the grill every year, and they were due by noon. Derek had positioned himself and his friends near the edge of the lot. He wasn't leaving. He was watching. And he was talking the way people talk when they want to be overheard, making observations just loud enough to carry, layering in comments about Ray's garage, about Megan's attitude, about how some women mistake stubbornness for toughness. His friends responded dutifully. They were the audience. He'd always had people whose function was to reflect whatever he projected. At 12:10, he walked back toward Megan. She was at the front table handling a line of 3 people registering for the raffle. She saw him coming, and she kept her expression neutral and her voice professionally calm as she finished with the person in front of her. When Derek reached the table, he leaned on it with one elbow. "You going to apologize?" he asked her. "For what?" Megan said. "For accusing me of damaging that bike on purpose. I didn't accuse you. I told my sister what I saw. Same thing." "It isn't." He leaned a little closer. "I don't like people spreading lies about me." "Then don't do things that look like what they look like." She kept her voice even. "Please move back from the table. You're blocking." He shoved it. Not violently, not with full force, just enough a single flat palm push against the edge of the registration table that the materials shifted, and 2 cups of pens went over, and Megan had to catch the donation box before it slid off the edge. People nearby went quiet. Derek straightened up and stepped back like it had been an accident, like his elbow had simply caught the edge. Megan stood very still with the donation box in both hands. Ray was across the lot. She'd already started moving. She covered the distance in the time it takes to form a sentence, came around the front of the table, and stopped between Derek and Megan without touching either of them. She looked at Derek. "You need to leave," she said. He was ready this time. He'd been building toward this all morning, and now he was here, and he had his friends recording, and he had his father 10 yards behind him watching, and he had every advantage that ego provides when it mistakes preparation for power. "Or what?" he said. "Or I call the police and give them the footage we already have from this morning, plus what just happened." Derek looked at the table. "I bumped it. Nobody believes that. You calling me a liar? I'm telling you to leave." He looked past her at Megan. "She started this." "She didn't start anything," Ray said. "And we're done talking. Either you walk to your car right now," or he put his hand on Ray's shoulder. Not a grab, not a strike, just a hand on her shoulder pushing casually, dismissively, the way you might push a door that was blocking your way. What happened next took less than 3 seconds. Ray's hand came up, rotated, redirected his arm. Her weight shifted. Derek's balance went sideways, and then his momentum carried him forward, and he had to step quickly to keep from going down. He caught himself. He hadn't fallen. But he'd been moved, redirected, off balance, suddenly facing the wrong direction, and it had happened so smoothly that half the people watching weren't entirely sure what had occurred. Ray stepped back immediately. She put distance between them. She didn't press. She didn't follow. She just stood there with her hands at her sides and her breathing unchanged. Derek turned around. His face was red. "What did you just don't touch me?" she said quietly. "I'm asking you one more time to leave." His friends had their phones up. Richard was coming across the lot now. Derek's face was cycling through about 6 different emotions and landing mostly on humiliation, which for Derek Vaughn was the most dangerous one. "You want to fight?" he said. The word fight came out stripped of everything except its rawness. "Is that what you want?" "No," Ray said. "I want you to go home. Because you're scared. Because we're doing a fundraiser and you're embarrassing yourself." That landed worse than anything else she could have said. She hadn't said it cruelly. She'd said it The way you say something true that you'd rather not have to say. He reached behind himself. Someone handed him his training gloves. He pulled them on slowly, making a performance of it, letting everyone watch. His friends spread out a little, creating space. Richard stopped at the edge of the gathering crowd and watched without moving. Derek raised his hands. "Put the gloves on," he said. "Let's settle this right." Ray looked at him. "I'm not putting on gloves because you know you'll lose. Because I'm not fighting you." "Old lady," Derek said, and the words came out slow and deliberate, designed to cut, designed to land in front of an audience. "Put the gloves on. Unless you're scared." Silence. He had what he wanted. He had the crowd. He had the recording. He had his father watching. He had the moment he'd been engineering all morning, the public humiliation of the woman who kept refusing to be afraid of him. Either she put on the gloves and he beat her in front of everyone, or she refused and he got to stand there in front of her neighbors and customers and call her a coward. He thought those were the only two options. Ray asked him once, quietly, whether he really wanted to do this. He laughed. She asked him again. He told her to stop stalling. She asked a third time, and this time she wasn't looking at him the same way. The composure was still there. But something else had arrived in her eyes, not anger, not aggression, something more like grief. The specific grief of someone who has tried every available exit from a situation and found them all closed. She stepped forward, not with the gloves. She'd said she wasn't putting on gloves, and she meant it. She stepped forward with her hands open and her weight settled, and she said, "You wanted everyone watching. They're watching now." Derek moved first. He was fast, genuinely, technically fast, and his opening combination was clean. Tournament clean. Competition clean. Calculated for point scoring and designed to impress. Ray wasn't competing. She moved sideways rather than backward. She let first combination pass and redirected the second and gave him no surface to land on because she kept refusing to stand where he expected her to stand. His rhythm was built for an opponent who engaged on the same terms. Ray wouldn't engage on any terms except her own. Derek threw a kick. She stepped inside it before it had power. He overextended and she redirected his shoulder, and he stumbled 2 steps before he caught himself. The crowd had gone completely silent. Derek came back harder, more committed, less technical. He was starting to fight from emotion rather than training, which was exactly what she'd been waiting for. Not because she wanted to exploit it, but because emotion was always where the exit would be, the place where a person could finally hear what was being said instead of just reacting to the volume. Then something stopped everything. A sound. It came from the distance first, a vibration more than a sound, the kind of thing you feel in your chest before your ears process it. Derek paused. He looked toward the road. He smiled. He thought it was thunder. He thought she'd finally shown some fear, some hesitation, some sign that she knew the moment was getting away from her. He turned to his friends like a man who was about to deliver a punchline he'd been saving. Ray wasn't looking at him anymore. She was looking at the road. The vibration became a sound, and the sound became a roar. And around the long curve of the desert highway came the first headlight, and then the second, and then they kept coming, 32 motorcycles in formation, riding 2 abreast, colors visible from 100 yards, the distinctive hells, angles patches that this community had seen at every charity event, every veteran's funeral, every moment when showing up mattered more than showing off. At the front was Cal Mercer. Everyone called him Grizzly. He was 61 years old. He had forearms that looked like they'd been engineered rather than grown. He had a beard that had gone silver and gray and a face that had accumulated enough history to make most men uncomfortable. He had ridden into this parking lot every year for the past 9 years because Ray Callahan organized a fundraiser for people who deserved better than they got, and because she was one of the few people he trusted to do something worthwhile with money that was raised in her name. He pulled in slowly. The formations followed him. One by one, engines shut down. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one that had existed before. This one had weight. Derek's smile was gone. He stood in the center of the parking lot with his training gloves on his hands, and 32 Hells Angels riders watching him from their bikes. And for the first time all morning, he looked like exactly what he was, a young man who had badly miscalculated. Grizzly swung off his bike. He walked across the lot at the same unhurried pace Ray used when she walked toward things that needed handling. He stopped beside her and looked at Derek and then back at her. "Everything good, Ray?" She looked at the young man across from her. She looked at his gloves, his friends with their phones, his father at the edge of the crowd with an expression that had curdled from confidence into something more calculating. "It will be," she said, and she meant it, not as a threat, not as a promise of retribution, as a simple statement of fact from a woman who understood better than anyone present that the real confrontation in this parking lot had never been about who could hit harder. It had always been about something Derek Vaughn didn't yet have a word for, but he was about to learn it. Grizzly didn't say anything else after that. He didn't need to. He walked back to his bike, said something low to the rider beside him, and the whole crew began moving parking properly, pulling off helmets, shaking hands, with the veterans already gathered near the far. They'd done this before. They knew exactly how to exist in a space without taking it over. That was the thing about men like Grizzly. They understood the difference between presence and dominance. One cost you nothing. The other cost everyone around you everything. Derek didn't understand that distinction yet. He was still standing in the middle of the lot with his training gloves on his hands and nowhere useful to put his eyes. His friends had lowered their phones, not because anyone told them to, but because 32 motorcycle riders quietly doing ordinary things somehow made the recording feel embarrassing rather than triumphant. The audience had arrived, and it wasn't the one Derek had ordered. Richard Vaughn had gone quiet too. He stood at the edge of the lot with his hands in his pockets and a face that had rearranged itself from smug satisfaction into careful evaluation. Richard was the kind of man who was always calculating. Even now, even in the middle of something that wasn't going the way he'd planned, some part of his brain was already running the numbers on what this cost and how to recover it. Ray had not moved. She stood exactly where she'd been standing when the motorcycles came around the bend, and she watched Derek with an expression that held nothing punishing in it, no satisfaction, no contempt, just the patient attention of someone waiting for a person to make a decision they'd have to live with. Derek pulled off the training gloves. He didn't do it gracefully. He yanked at the Velcro with more force than necessary, stuffed the gloves under one arm, and walked toward his friends without looking at Ray. He said something to the nearest one too quiet to hear, and the friend nodded quickly. Then Derek walked to his car, got in, and sat there. He didn't leave. He sat. Megan appeared at Ray's elbow. She'd come around from the back of the registration table, and she stood close, the way she stood when she was trying to assess whether Ray was actually all right without directly asking, because directly asking would require Ray to answer honestly, and neither of them had the time for that right now. "He's not leaving," Megan said. "I know. That's not a good sign." "Probably not." Megan was quiet for a moment. "Then you okay?" Ray looked at her sister. "Are you?" Megan tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, which was what she did when she was trying not to show that something had rattled her. "He grabbed my arm, Ray. He didn't just bump the table. He grabbed my arm and pulled me back when I tried to walk away." "I know. You knew before I told you?" "I knew before you told me." Megan exhaled. "I hate that you can read things like that." "No, you don't." A short silence. Then Megan almost smiled. "No, I don't." She looked toward Derek's car. "He's not done." "He's not done," Ray agreed, "but that's okay. Neither are we." She walked back toward the garage to find Grizzly, because there was a fundraiser to run and a grill that needed someone who knew how to manage the charcoal without turning everything into charcoal. And that had always been Grizzly's specific and irreplaceable contribution to the afternoon. But the story of how they'd gotten here, how Ray Callahan and Derek Vaughn had arrived at this particular Saturday in this particular parking lot with this particular wait between them, that story had not started this morning. It had started weeks earlier. in the ordinary way that most significant things start, which is to say quietly, without any announcement of what it was going to become. 6 weeks before the fundraiser, the Vaughns moved in. Not to the neighborhood exactly. Richard had purchased a commercial property 2 blocks north of Callahan Motor Works as part of expanding Vaughn Desert Freight into the northern Arizona corridor. He had an existing freight operation in the southern part of the state, a legitimate and fairly successful one by most accounts, and he decided the time was right to push north. He needed a dispatch hub. He found one. He bought it. He moved his operation in with the efficiency of a man who was accustomed to acquiring things without asking whether the existing landscape welcomed them. Derek came with the move. Whether he'd wanted to or not, no one who watched the two of them together could quite tell. The first time Ray saw him, he was in the parking lot of the convenience store, 3 blocks from her garage, sitting on the hood of his car with 2 friends, talking at a volume that suggested he wanted people to know he was talking. He had a tournament medal hanging from the rearview mirror of his car. Not a trophy, a medal. The kind that could be worn around a neck. He'd hung it where other people hung air fresheners. She bought her coffee, got back in her truck, and drove to work without thinking about him further. The second time she saw him, he drove past the garage at a speed that made the older man sitting in the waiting area flinch visibly and reach for the armrests of his chair. Ray wrote down the plate number, not for any particular reason, just because it was the kind of habit that occasionally proved useful. The third time he stopped. She'd been out front with a customer, Danny Reyes, 27 years old, 2-year-old daughter. Transmission on his work truck, making a sound that was costing him sleep, walking him through what the repair would involve and approximately what it would cost. Danny was doing the math in real time with his face, the way people do when the number is more than they have and they're trying to figure out how to absorb it without showing how much it hurts. Derek pulled up and stopped at the edge of the lot, half in and half out of the road. "Hey," he called through the window. "Is this Callahan's?" Ray looked at the sign above the garage bay door, then back at him. "It is." "You the mechanic?" "I'm one of them." "Can I help you?" He looked at her for a moment with an expression she was already beginning to recognize, the particular look of a young man who has decided that a woman doing physical work is a curiosity rather than a professional. "My buddy's bike is making noise. Rear wheel. Might bring it by." "Sure," she said. "Call ahead so I can schedule it." "Can't you just look at it when we bring it?" "I could. But if you call ahead, I can make sure I have the right time and parts for it. Makes it better for both of us." He considered this. "You always this particular?" "I'm organized," she said. "There's a difference." He drove away. He didn't call ahead. He also never brought the bike. That was how Derek Vaughn operated. He was always on the verge of doing something, always positioning himself at the edge of an action, always implying that he could and might. The actual follow-through was optional, dependent entirely on whether there was an audience for it and whether the action would reflect well on him. Ray filed him in the part of her mind reserved for things that required monitoring. He started coming around more consistently in the second week after the Vaughns moved in, not always for any reason. Sometimes he'd pull in, park, walk through the lot, looking at vehicles, the way a man looks at things he's evaluating for purchase, even though he has no intention of buying anything. He'd ask questions that weren't really questions. "How long has this place been here? And do you do much business?" And seems like a lot of work for 2 women, and Ray would answer the ones that deserved answers and ignore the ones that didn't. The black belt came up on the 4th visit. He'd been talking to a young mechanic named Torres who worked 2 afternoons a week for Ray, doing apprentice-level work while he finished his certification. Torres was 20, interested in fight and completely susceptible to Derek's performance of expertise. Ray came out of the office to find Derek showing Torres a combination against the side of the building shadow boxing at full speed, narrating his own technique, explaining about the tournament he'd won in Tucson and the one before that in Phoenix, and the one before that where he'd almost made it to regionals, but the judging was political. Torres was watching with his arms crossed and his head tilted, the posture of someone being simultaneously impressed and vaguely skeptical. Ray stood in the doorway. Derek saw her and shifted his demonstration so it was facing her. "You ever do any training?" he asked. "Some," she said. "What kind?" "Enough." He smiled. "Enough to win tournaments, enough to not need them." That stopped him for half a second. Then he laughed. "You're funny." He looked at Torres. "She's funny, right?" Torres looked at Ray. Ray looked at Torres. Torres found something important to examine on the ground near his feet. "I'm serious," Ray said. "I'm glad you have your belt. That's real work. But I've got a customer coming in 20 minutes and I need Torres on the lift." It was a dismissal delivered without cruelty. But it was a dismissal, and Derek felt every inch of it. He covered it, quickly, laughed again, slapped Torres on the shoulder, said he'd come back sometime, made it sound like leaving was his idea. But as he walked to his car, the set of his shoulders said something different. Torres watched him go. "He's intense," he said. "He's insecure," Ray said, "which looks the same from a distance. Come on." Lift 3. The harassment, and that was the word for it. Even if no individual incident was severe enough to justify the term in isolation, escalated gradually. That was how it always worked. A single large event was easy to address. A series of small ones, each deniable, each marginally within the range of what you could almost explain away, was much harder. He began parking in front of the garage entrance for 20 minutes at a time, technically not blocking it, but practically making it inconvenient. He started showing up during the busiest hours, when Ray had the least time to deal with him, and inserting himself into conversations with customers in ways that were technically friendly but functionally disruptive. He told one waiting customer, an older woman named Mrs. Parkins, whose car was in for an oil change, that he was surprised they didn't rip women off here since most garages did. He said it with a smile. He said it like a compliment. Mrs. Parkins had been coming to Callahan Motor Works for 7 years. She came back the following week and told Ray what he'd said and apologized for almost believing it, which broke Ray's heart in a small and quiet way. Megan kept a log. She wrote down dates, times, descriptions. Ray had asked her to start doing it at the end of the second week, not for any immediate purpose. Just because documentation was what you built before you needed it, not after. The wrist incident happened on a Thursday afternoon. Derek had come in with one of his friends, a quieter one, whose name Ray later learned was Preston, and who had the permanently uneasy look of someone who understood that the situations he was being brought into were not situations he'd chosen. They'd been looking at a used bike in the lot that Ray had taken in trade on a repair. It wasn't for sale formally, but Derek had decided to make an offer anyway, the way men like Derek made offers not as requests, but as presumptions. Ray told him the bike wasn't available. "Everything's available," Derek said. "It's a number. This one isn't." "Why?" "Because it belongs to someone who's coming to collect it in 2 weeks. You tell them you got a better offer, and they'll understand." "I don't work that way." He looked at her. "That's a bad business decision." "It's my business decision. Thank you for stopping by." She turned to walk back into the garage. His hand closed around her wrist. Not hard. Not the way you'd grab someone you intended to hurt. More the way someone grabs a door handle automatically, without thinking about what the door might feel about it. "I'm not done talking," he said. What happened after that happened fast. Ray's arm rotated. Her grip changed. Her weight shifted in a way that looked almost casual from the outside. The kind of adjustment that looks like nothing until the person it's being done to suddenly finds that their balance isn't where they expected it to be, and their arm is in a position that is uncomfortable without being fully committed to pain. Derek made a sound, not a cry, more a sharp exhale, and stepped forward instinctively to relieve the pressure, which put him exactly where Ray needed him. She released him. Completely. Immediately. Step back, hands open, no follow-through. Derek stood there staring at his own arm, like it had done something without his permission. Preston hadn't moved. He was standing very still, with an expression that said he had seen something important and was deciding how to process it. "Don't touch me," Ray said. Her voice was the same. "No elevation. No shake. That's the last time I'll say that." Derek looked at her. He was breathing harder than the situation called for. His face had gone through several colors in the past 5 seconds and settled on red. Where'd you? He stopped. Started again. You some kind of martial artist? I'm a mechanic, she said. Good afternoon, Derek. She walked inside. Behind her, she heard Preston say something to Derek in a low voice, and then Derek's voice come back sharper, cutting him off. She didn't look back. Inside the office, Megan was standing at the window. I saw, she said. Write it down, Ray said. Already am. That evening, after Taurus had left and the last car had been collected and Megan had gone home, Ray sat at the workbench with the parts catalog she didn't actually need to look at and a cup of coffee she wasn't actually drinking. She was thinking about Derek Vaughn, not with anger, with something more like recognition. She'd known people like him before, not many, not often, but enough to understand the architecture, the performance of capability that existed to cover a genuine terror of being ordinary, the need for an audience that went so deep it had replaced actual relationship. The father who'd spent a decade teaching the boy that softness was strategy and vulnerability was surrender. She'd seen Richard Vaughn with his son 3 times now, and in each of those 3 times, Richard had done the same thing. When Derek told a story, Richard listened with the expression of a man checking facts. When Derek made a decision, Richard commented on its efficiency. When Derek expressed enthusiasm, Richard responded with evaluation. There was no cruelty in it exactly, just the steady drip of a man who confused assessment with affection. Ray had grown up with a father who was the opposite of that. Frank Callahan had been rough around every available edge and terrible at formal expressions of anything, but when either of his daughters did something they were proud of, he stopped whatever he was doing and looked at them. Really looked. Like they were the most interesting thing in his world. She thought Derek Vaughn had probably never been looked at like that. She felt something that she hadn't expected to feel when she started thinking about him, which was something adjacent to sorrow. Not sympathy exactly, not forgiveness for behavior that hadn't finished happening yet. Just the specific sadness of recognizing a wound that someone is using as a weapon because they don't know it's a wound. She finished the cold coffee, rinsed the mug, turned off the garage lights. Tomorrow she had 6 vehicles coming in, a parts order to verify, and a fundraiser to finish organizing. That was plenty. Derek Vaughn was not her problem. She told herself that on the walk to her truck. She told herself that pulling out of the lot. She told herself that twice more before she got home, which was approximately twice more than she'd have needed to if it were actually true. The week before the fundraiser, he went after Megan directly, not physically. Nothing Megan could point to and call assault. He'd learned something from the wrist incident, not the lesson Ray intended, which was that there were limits and consequences, but the lesson he'd constructed for himself from the same material, which was that Ray was more capable than he'd assessed, and therefore the way to get to Ray was through a softer target. Megan was handling a difficult customer complaint when Derek came into the front office. She was on the phone, standing at the desk, dealing with a man who was unhappy about a repair estimate and expressing that unhappiness in the way unhappy people sometimes do, which is to say loudly and without particular regard for what was actually true. Derek sat down in the waiting area. He didn't announce himself. He didn't cause any visible problem. He sat and he watched Megan handle the phone call. When she hung up, he said, "That guy was really ripping into you." Megan looked at him. "Can I help you with something?" "You handled it okay, but he was really on you." Customers sometimes have concerns. He wasn't being polite about it. "I'm aware. Is there something I can help you with?" Derek leaned back in the chair and crossed his arms. "You ever think about whether this place is actually worth it? Like for you personally? The stress?" Megan stopped. She looked at him with the careful attention of someone who is hearing something that sounds like concern but smells like something else entirely. "This is our garage," she said. "Mine and my sister's. I know that. I'm just saying. You're in the front dealing with unhappy customers. She's in the back doing the work. What's the split on that?" "That's our arrangement." "Sounds like you do the hard part without the interesting part." Megan put her hands flat on the desk. Derek, she said, and her voice was controlled, but only just. What are you doing here today? Just visiting. We're not friends. He smiled. We could be. We couldn't. She held his gaze. I'd like you to leave. He didn't leave immediately. He sat for another 30 seconds, long enough to make it clear he was leaving when he decided to. Not when she asked, and then he stood, stretched, and walked out. Megan waited until she heard his car leave the lot. Then she sat down in the desk chair and put her hands in her lap and stared at the wall. She was still sitting like that when Ray came in from the garage. He was here, Megan said. Ray already knew. She'd seen his car from the bay window. She'd stayed in the garage deliberately, because some situations she could de-escalate by walking in and some she made worse. And she'd needed a moment to decide which this was. She'd stayed too long, made the wrong call. What did he say? Megan told her. Ray listened to all of it without interrupting. When Megan finished, there was a short silence. He's trying to divide us, Ray said. I know. Make you feel like you're getting less than you deserve here. I know. Ray, does it work? Even a little? Megan looked at her. Of course it doesn't work. He's 23 years old, and he's been handed everything he has, and he has no idea what it looks like to actually build something. She paused. It doesn't work, but it's exhausting. I know. When does it stop? Ray thought about the fundraiser coming up. She thought about Grizzly's crew arriving Saturday. She thought about 32 engines on a desert road and the particular quality of attention that 32 witnesses provided. Soon, she said. She didn't mean it as a promise of violence. She meant it as a statement of probability. A man who needed an audience was going to find one eventually. And when he found the wrong audience, the performance was going to collapse under its own weight. She was right about that. She was just slightly wrong about how complete the collapse would be before it was over, and about how much it was going to cost Derek before anything in him got a chance to grow. The fundraiser was 6 days away. Richard Vaughn called her office the following morning. Miss Callahan, he said, I think we got off on the wrong foot. I think your son puts his hands on people without permission, Ray said. Vaughn, that's not a wrong foot. That's a pattern. A pause. He's a young man. He's finding his way. He found my sister's arm. I'll talk to him. You'll do more than talk to him, Ray said. The mirror for Mr. Delacroix's motorcycle is being invoiced to your company. I expect payment within 10 days. If there are further incidents, I will file a formal complaint, and I will make sure that every piece of documentation my sister and I have collected is part of that filing. Another pause. Longer this time. You're very sure of yourself, Richard said. I'm very sure of my documentation, she said. Those are different things. Have a good day, Mr. Vaughn. She hung up. Megan. From the doorway, he's going to come to the fundraiser. Yes. And Derek. Yes. And you're going to let them. Ray picked up her coffee mug. It's a public event for veterans and struggling families. I don't get to decide who comes. She took a drink. But I do get to decide how I respond to whatever happens when they do. Megan leaned against the doorframe and looked at her sister for a long moment. Do you actually know something we don't know about how this ends? Ray thought about Grizzly and his crew and 9 years of Saturday fundraisers and 32 men who showed up every year, not for the recognition, but because showing up was its own complete answer. No, she said. But I know who's going to be in that parking lot, and I know what they stand for. She set down the mug. That's usually enough. Megan was quiet. Then you're not scared at all, are you? It wasn't quite a question. Ray thought about Derek's face in that parking lot when the engine started coming around the bend. She thought about the exact moment his smile had died. She thought about a young man who had spent his entire life being taught that strength was what you performed for other people, and who was about to discover, in front of the largest audience he'd ever gathered for himself, that the woman he'd called old lady had been something none of his training had prepared him for. I was scared this morning, she said, when he had his hand on Megan's arm. Not for me, for her. She picked up the parts order and walked back toward the garage. That's the only kind of scared worth being. Grizzly's question hung in the air for exactly 1 second before Derek answered it, not with words, But with his body, he moved. Not toward Grizzly, not toward the riders. He moved toward Ray, and he moved fast, the way a person moves when humiliation has finished converting itself into something less complicated and more dangerous. His right hand came up, and his left foot planted, and the combination he threw was the cleanest thing he'd produced all morning. No showboating, no performance, just pure trained muscle memory firing, because his conscious mind had finally stepped aside and let the anger drive. Ray wasn't there when it arrived. She'd moved left before he committed, reading the shoulder drop that telegraphed the combination the same way you read an engine sound before it becomes a problem. His right hand passed through empty air. His left followed and found nothing. The momentum carried him forward, and Ray was already behind his left shoulder, her hand on his elbow, redirecting rather than blocking. And Derek stumbled 2 steps and caught himself against nothing and spun around. The crowd had sucked in a collective breath and forgotten to let it out. Grizzly hadn't moved. None of the riders had moved. They stood beside their bikes with the particular stillness of people who have the capacity for action and are choosing, deliberately and visibly, not to exercise it. That restraint was its own statement. 32 men who could have ended this in 15 seconds were choosing to let Ray handle it because Ray was handling it. And they knew the difference between a woman who needed rescue and a woman who needed room. Derek came back. His technique was degrading in real time, the tournament precision giving way to something rawer, angrier, more committed to landing rather than to scoring. He threw a kick that was powerful but overextended, and Ray stepped inside the arc of it where there was no power, caught his lead arm as his balance shifted, and used his own forward momentum to guide him past her. He went down on one knee, caught himself on both hands, and was back up in under 2 seconds. His friends were silent. Richard Vaughn was not silent. Derek! His voice came across the lot with the authority of a man who had spent decades making that voice work in boardrooms and on job sites and in arguments with people who had less money than him. Stop playing around and finish it. Something happened in Derek's face when he heard that. Something small and complicated that Ray caught and filed because she was watching him closer than anyone else in that lot was watching him. It wasn't encouragement that crossed his face when his father spoke. It was something closer to confirmation of a fear. The fear that this was what his father was, that these were the words his father had for him in this moment, and that they were not the words he actually needed. He came at her again. This time Ray didn't redirect. She planted her feet, rolled her shoulder to deflect his lead, and when he overcommitted on the follow-up, she wrapped his arm, stepped through, and brought him down. Not a slam, not a statement. A controlled takedown that ended with Derek on his back, her knee beside his head, her hand light on his shoulder. He could feel that she wasn't pressing. He could feel that she had options she wasn't using. He lay on the asphalt of his own chosen battlefield and stared up at the Arizona sky and breathed hard and felt, for the first time, in longer than he could clearly remember, completely and utterly out of arguments. Ray released him, stood, stepped back. She extended her hand. Derek stared at it. The crowd around them was doing that thing crowds do when something unexpected has revealed itself in public, the uncertain murmur of people recalibrating what they thought they were watching. This wasn't the fight they'd been prepared to see. This was something harder to categorize and harder to look away from. Derek's hand moved toward Ray's, stopped. Then Richard Vaughn walked onto the field. He came fast, and he came loud, the way a man comes when he's decided that volume is his best remaining weapon. "This is assault," he said. "Everyone here is a witness. She attacked my son on his own. He initiated every exchange," said a voice from the crowd. Richard turned. The voice belonged to a woman in her 60s named Eleanor Marsh, who had been attending this fundraiser for 5 years and had the kind of face that people instinctively trusted. She was holding her phone up. She'd been recording from the beginning. "So did I," said another voice. A man this time. Then 2 more. Then a teenager who'd been sitting on the tailgate of a truck the entire time. Richard looked at the phones. He counted them. Something moved through his face, not embarrassment, Richard Vaughn had not been embarrassed in a very long time, but something related to calculation. He was adding up what this meant. Grizzly walked over. He stopped beside Ray, not in front of her, not between her and Richard, but beside her. The positioning was deliberate, and Richard read it correctly. "I'll tell you one thing," Richard said, his voice dropping into the register he used when he wanted to sound reasonable while delivering threats. "This isn't over. I have attorneys. You're welcome to call them," Ray said. "I have documentation going back 6 weeks." "Of what?" "Of my son visiting a garage, of property damage, harassment, physical contact with my sister, and today's events." She let that settle. "All documented, all time-stamped, several of it on security camera," she paused, "which you walked past when you came in." Richard looked at the corner of the building where the camera housing was mounted. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he should have seen earlier and didn't. Derek had gotten to his feet without taking Ray's hand. He was standing slightly apart from everything now, slightly apart from his father, slightly apart from his friends, in the specific physical isolation of a person who has just realized that the space they're standing in doesn't feel like theirs anymore. His father turned to him. "Get to the car." Derek didn't move. "Derek, car now. He can stay," Ray said quietly. "Or he can go. That's his choice." It was 4 words, "that's his choice," and they detonated in the space between father and son with a force that had nothing to do with volume. Richard had spent 23 years making choices for Derek, managing the narrative, paying consequences, positioning the story. And here was a woman with grease under her fingernails telling his son in front of 30-something witnesses that the decision belonged to him. Richard's jaw tightened. Derek looked at Ray, then at his father, then at the ground. He walked to the car. Richard followed. The SUV pulled out of the lot. The lot watched it go. The silence lasted about 5 full seconds, which is a long time for a crowd of people. And then Grizzly made a sound that was approximately a laugh and said, "If anybody want to eat? Because I drove 2 hours and I'm not riding back hungry." The crowd unclenched. Megan found Ray at the workbench 20 minutes later, going through a parts invoice that didn't need reviewing. It was the thing Ray did when her hands needed something to do while her mind was elsewhere. "You're checking that invoice for the 3rd time," Megan said. "I'm being thorough. You're processing." Megan sat on the stool across from her. "Are you hurt?" "No." "Did you want to hurt him, Ray?" "Set the invoice down." She thought about that, honestly, the way she thought about most things without protecting herself from the answer. "There was a moment," she said, "when he shoved your table. When I knew you'd been scared, and I knew he'd done it on purpose, and I knew his father was standing 20 feet away, approving of every bit of it." She picked up the invoice again. "There was a moment. What stopped you?" "What I wanted more than the moment." Megan was quiet for a beat. "Which was what?" Ray looked at her sister. "To still be myself when it was over." Megan absorbed that. She had the expression she got when Ray said something that she was going to think about for a long time without necessarily responding to right away. "He's going to be back," she said finally. "I know. His father's going to make this into something. He's going to try. What do we do?" Ray stood up and put the invoice in the correct folder. "We run a fundraiser. We feed some veterans. We let Grizzly overcook the burgers like he does every year, and we don't tell him until he asks. And we raise the money we came here to raise." She looked at Megan. "And then tomorrow we call the department, and we put everything on record before Richard Vaughn puts his version on record first." "You think he's calling his attorney tonight?" "I think he's calling his attorney from the parking lot." Ray picked up her coffee. "But I documented every incident as it happened. He's going to discover that people who plan ahead are very hard to run over." Megan almost laughed. "You sound like Dad." "Good." Ray walked toward the bay door. Dad was usually right. Outside, the fundraiser had resumed with the particular resilience of community events run by people who understand that you don't let one bad actor determine the temperature of the day. The grill was going. The raffle table was active. Kids had found the open space near the north end of the lot and were doing what kids do with open space, which is run in directions without visible logic. Grizzly was at the grill, with two of his crew, a man named Boone, who was 54 and had forearms that suggested he'd wrestled industrial equipment for a living, and a younger rider named Castillo, who everyone called Cass, and who had come back from a deployment 18 months ago and was still finding his land legs. Cass didn't say much. He was good at being present, which was its own valuable thing. Ray walked over and stood beside Grizzly. He handed her a plate without looking at her. "Eat. I'm not hungry. I didn't ask if you were hungry." He put a burger on the plate. "Eat." She ate. It was good, even slightly overcooked, which she did not tell him. They stood in comfortable quiet for a moment. Grizzly had a talent for quiet that most people his size didn't. He could occupy silence without filling it, which was a rarer skill than most people recognized. "He's going to call it an ambush," Grizzly said finally. The old man. "He's going to say you called us here to intimidate them." "I know. You didn't call us." "I know I didn't. We've been coming to this thing for 9 years." "I know that too." Grizzly turned the next set of burgers. "It's going to get complicated." His old man's got money. Money buys complicated. Money buys complicated, Ray agreed. "But it doesn't buy what he's going to be up against." She looked out at the lot. Eleanor Marsh was at the donation table now, still holding her phone, talking to two other women who had also been recording. He walked into a parking lot full of people who document things. He didn't walk into the version of this he planned for. Grizzly made the sound again, the approximate laugh. "You got a cold brain, Ray. My dad called it practical." "It's both." He handed her another plate. "Take that to Cass. He forgets to eat when he gets quiet like that." She took the plate to Castillo, who was sitting on a cooler near the bikes, looking at his hands. He took the plate without looking up. She sat beside him for a moment. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah," a pause. "That was something. What you did. It wasn't supposed to be anything. Doesn't matter what it was supposed to be." He finally looked up. His eyes were steady, the way eyes get when someone has seen enough real things to calibrate what's worth being shaken by. He kept coming. He had the physical advantage and the audience, and you just kept not giving him what he was there for. "He was there to win," Ray said. "He was there to dominate." Cass shook his head. "Different thing." Ray looked at him. "How are you doing, actually?" Cass was quiet for a moment. "Better than last month. Worse than next month." A small shrug. "That's the math. That's acceptable math." Grizzly says the same thing. He picked up the burger and looked at it. He overcooks them. Every year. Why does nobody tell him? Because he means well and it costs nothing. And some things aren't worth the conversation. She stood. "Eat the burger, Cass." He almost smiled. She went back to work. The afternoon moved forward the way good afternoons do when difficult things have passed, not perfectly, not without the residual weight of what happened, but forward. Donations came in steadily. The raffle drew a crowd. 3 veterans who hadn't been planning to attend showed up because one of the Hell's Angles riders had called them directly and told them there was food and people who wanted to see them. At 2:15, a police cruiser pulled into the lot. Not with lights, not with urgency. A single cruiser, Officer Pamela Cook driving, whom Ray had known for 7 years. Pam Cook was the kind of officer who showed up to community events because she lived in the community, not because she was required to. She got out, looked at the lot, looked at the grill, looked at Grizzly's crew. "Heard there was an incident," she said to Ray. "There was. You want to walk me through it?" "I do." They walked. Ray gave her the sequence, calmly and completely, from Derek's arrival that morning, through the property damage, through the confrontation, through Grizzly's arrival, and what followed after. She gave it with dates and times for the 6 weeks of prior incidents. She referenced the security camera footage and the multiple civilian recordings. She mentioned the documentation Megan had maintained. Pam Cook took notes without expression. "Richard Vaughn," she said at one point. "Yes." "Vaughn Desert Freight." "Yes." "He's got pull with the city council." "I'm aware." Pam looked at her. "You documented everything." "Yes, before today. From the beginning." Pam closed her notebook. "I'm going to need copies of all of that, and I'm going to need to talk to the witnesses separately." She looked at the crowd. "How many people recorded the confrontation?" At least 8 that identified themselves. Probably more who didn't. Pam Cook made a sound that was not quite professional neutrality. Okay. She clicked her pen closed. I'll tell you something. Ray, off the record, and between us. Richard Vaughn called the department 45 minutes ago. Ray waited. He described it as his son being assaulted by a mob of gang members that you'd assembled for the purpose. A pause. Ray looked at the lot. At Grizzly at the grill. At Boone drinking water from a bottle. At Cass sitting on his cooler with his plate. At 30 riders who had parked properly and stayed uninvolved and fed veterans and donated money to families who needed it. What's your assessment of that description? Ray said. Pam Cook looked at the same lot. My assessment is that the footage is going to speak for itself. She put the notebook in her pocket. But I wanted you to know, he's moving fast. He always moves fast, Ray said. He just usually moves into spaces where there's no documentation. Pam almost smiled. Go enjoy your fundraiser. I'm going to get a burger and talk to some witnesses. Tell Grizzly it's good, Ray said. He'll appreciate it. Is it good? It's a little overcooked. Pam Cook got a burger. At 3:40, something happened that Ray hadn't planned for. Derek came back. Not with his father. Not with his friends. He pulled in alone in his car and parked at the edge of the lot and sat there for approximately 4 minutes while Ray watched him from the garage doorway, running the calculation on what this was. He wasn't there to fight. His body language was wrong for that too inward, too uncertain. He sat behind the wheel with both hands in his lap and he looked at the lot and he looked at the people in it and he looked at the riders and he looked at Ray. She walked to his car. He rolled down the window. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before, which was the expression of someone who doesn't have a prepared version of themselves ready. I'm not here to cause problems, he said. Okay. He stopped. Started again. How many of those guys were here when it happened? All of them. He looked at the riders. And none of them, not one of them stepped in? No. Why not? Ray leaned against the car door and looked at him directly. Because they knew I didn't need them to. Derek turned that over. He was doing things he clearly did when his defenses were down, and he was actually thinking rather than performing a slight tightening around the eyes, a specific quality of stillness that Ray recognized as someone genuinely processing something they didn't have a predetermined answer for. My dad says you called them here on purpose, he said. Your dad wasn't there when Grizzly's crew pulled in. You were. What did you see? He was quiet for a moment. Ray's face, he said, and then seemed surprised that he'd used her name rather than the dismissive vocabulary he'd been using all day. Your face. You recognized the sound before I did. You knew who it was, yes. You weren't surprised. No, because they come every year. Every year for 9 years. Derek stared at the steering wheel. My dad's telling everyone you set it up, that you had them waiting. And what do you think? He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that it stopped being uncomfortable and became something else, the silence of a person genuinely sitting with a question rather than rushing to the answer that serves them best. I think, he said slowly, that you didn't need to set anything up. I think I walked into something that was already here. He paused. I think I've been walking into things that were already here since the day we moved. Ray didn't say anything. She knew better than to fill a silence that was working. Why did you offer your hand? He asked after. When I was on the ground. Why did you do that? Because the fight was over, she said simply. Not for me, it wasn't. I know. That's why I offered it. His jaw worked. I was going to take it. Before my father, he stopped. He always does that. What does he do? Derek looked up at her. He had his father's sharp eyes, but something behind them. That Richard didn't have a residual uncertainty, a capacity to be genuinely affected by things that Richard had either never possessed or had spent a lifetime successfully eliminating. He makes the choice for me, Derek said. And then somehow it ends up being my choice. And I end up defending a choice I didn't actually make. He exhaled through his nose. It's been like that my whole life. Ray absorbed that. Is that why you train? He blinked. What? The martial arts. Is that yours or is that his? Derek opened his mouth. Closed it. The question had landed somewhere real, and he hadn't braced for it. His expression went through several phases, in rapid succession defensiveness, then confusion, then something closer to genuine blankness, the look of a person discovering that a question they should have asked themselves years ago has never actually been asked. "I don't know," he said finally. It came out quiet and without decoration. "I genuinely don't know." That was the most honest thing Derek Vaughn had said in a very long time, possibly in years, and something in his face seemed to register the weight of it. Ray pushed off the car door. "The fundraiser's open for another 2 hours," she said. "There's food at the grill. Nobody's going to bother you if you want to stay." She paused. "And nobody's going to arrest you for being here. That's your father's version, not mine." Derek looked at her. "Why are you being decent to me? Because decent is the default," she said. "You have to work pretty hard to move me off it." She walked back toward the garage. Behind her, she heard the car door open. She didn't look back. Grizzly found her at the back of the garage at 4 o'clock, cleaning a part that didn't need cleaning. "The Vaughn kid's at the donation table," he said. Ray kept cleaning the part. "Okay, he put money in. Good, not a lot, but something." Grizzly crossed his arms and leaned against the bay wall. "You knew he'd come back." "I thought he might." "Why?" Ray set down the part and turned to look at him. "Because he's not his father. He's been trying to be, and it's been costing him more than he knows. But he's not." She picked up a shop rag. "His father won't come back. His father is on the phone with an attorney and a city councilman and 3 people who owe him favors, trying to rebuild a version of today where he's the victim." She wiped her hands. Derek came back alone with no audience and admitted something true to a woman he's been trying to intimidate for 6 weeks. That's not his father. That's something else. Grizzly was quiet for a moment. "You're a better person than me, Ray. You're a pretty good person. Cal." He looked away at the word Cal, which nobody used except her and one other person who was no longer living. "The officer. Cook. She talked to about 12 people. I know. Richard Vaughn's going to have a very bad week. He brought that with him when he came." Ray moved toward the bay door. "I didn't build the trap. He built it. I just documented it while he was building it." Grizzly made the approximate law sound. "Your dad would have loved this." Ray stopped. She didn't turn. She stood still for a moment, with the afternoon light coming through the bay door and the sound of the fundraiser continuing in the lot and 32 motorcycles parked in a row outside. "Yeah," she said. "He would have." She stepped out into the light. Derek Vaughn was standing at the edge of the donation table, talking to Cass. Cass was talking back. Neither of them looked comfortable exactly. But neither of them looked like they were pretending, which was more than most conversations managed. Megan appeared beside Ray and looked at the same thing. "Is that actually happening?" she said. "Looks like it." Cass is talking to Derek Vaughn. Cass talks to everybody eventually. Megan was quiet for a moment. "Do you think he's actually, do you think today changed something for him? Or is this just I don't know?" Ray said. "That's his part. I can't do that part for him." "What part did you do?" Ray watched the parking lot. She watched veterans eating food that Grizzly had overcooked with complete dedication. She watched Pam cook, writing in her notebook. She watched Eleanor Marsh putting her phone away with that satisfied expression of someone who has done something genuinely useful. She watched Derek Vaughn accept a bottle of water from Castillo and drink half of it in one go and look around the lot with the eyes of someone seeing something for the first time from the inside instead of the outside. "I didn't become what he expected," she said. "That's all. I just kept not becoming the thing he needed me to be for his version of the story to work." Megan looked at her. "That sounds easier than it was." "Everything sounds easier than it was," Ray said. "That's why we tell stories about it afterward." The sun was starting its long Arizona drop toward the horizon, painting the desert in the colors it reserved for late afternoon deep amber. Long shadows, the particular gold that made this landscape look like something that had been here long before people and would be here long after. The fundraiser would run another 90 minutes. The Hells Angels crew would help clean up the way they always did, quietly and efficiently, and without waiting to be thanked. The money raised would go to families who would use it carefully because they'd learned through necessity that careful was how you survived. Richard Vaughn was somewhere across town with his phone and his attorneys. Derek Vaughn was in this parking lot passing a water bottle to a veteran who didn't talk much. Those two facts said something that no courtroom argument and no social media narrative and no amount of money could fully rewrite. And Ray Callahan, standing in the doorway of her father's garage, the garage she and her sister had kept alive through hard years and lean years and years when the only reason to keep going was that stopping was worse. Ray Callahan looked at her community and felt something she hadn't expected to feel at the end of a day like this. She felt like herself, completely cleanly, without compromise, herself. It was, she thought, enough. The fundraiser money got counted that Sunday morning. Megan sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and 2 cups of coffee, one for her, one for Ray, who was leaning against the counter with her arms crossed, watching the numbers get written down. The total came out higher than any previous year, not by a little, by enough that Megan wrote it twice to confirm it, then looked up with an expression that was trying not to be surprised and not quite succeeding. People gave more, she said. People were paying attention, Ray said. Megan set down the pen. You think what happened, the confrontation, all of it, you think that's why. I think people showed up to a fundraiser and saw something real happen, and it reminded them why they came. Ray picked up her coffee. Money follows feeling. Always has. Megan looked at the number again. Dad would have said something embarrassing about this. He would have cried and then denied that he cried, and then told the story at every opportunity for the next 10 years. At least 10. They sat with that for a moment, the particular warmth of remembering someone accurately, not as a saint, but as a specific human being with specific habits, and finding that the accuracy made the memory more comforting, not less. Then Megan's phone buzzed. She looked at it. Her expression changed. What? Ray said. It's from Eleanor Marsh. Megan read the message twice. She says the footage is on social media. One of the kids who was recording posted it last night. A pause. It has 40,000 views. Ray set down her coffee. It had 40,000 views as of 6 this morning, Megan said. That was 2 hours ago. The silence in the kitchen was a different kind of silence than the one before it. The kind that arrives when the scale of something shifts faster than you've calibrated for. How does it look? Ray said. Megan was already watching. Her face said everything. Clear, she said finally. It's very clear. By Monday afternoon, the number was past 300,000. Ray found out because Torres called her from outside the garage before his shift and said, "Have you seen?" And she said, "I've seen it," which was not entirely true because she'd seen the number, but she hadn't watched the footage. And Torres said, "You should watch it." And she said, "Why?" And he said, "Because it doesn't look like what he's saying it looks like. It looks like what it actually was." She watched it that evening in the office, alone. The door closed. It was 4 minutes and 17 seconds. Whoever had posted it had used the full clip. Derek's provocation, the shove table, Ray's measured responses, the exchanges, Grizzly's arrival, the takedown, the offered hand, Richard's intervention. It was all there, unedited, unnarrated. The footage did exactly what good footage does, which is let the truth make its own argument without assistance. Ray watched Derek's face during the moments between the exchanges, the moments his father couldn't see, the brief windows when the performance dropped and something uncertain and searching moved across his features. The footage caught it. The internet was noticing it. The comment section was not a place Ray spent time normally, but she read enough to understand the shape of the response. The video had found the audience that footage like this always finds, not the young people interested in fight content, but older viewers, the people her channel would describe as being in their 50s and 60s and beyond, people who had lived enough to recognize the difference between a woman defending it and a woman performing aggression, people who had seen enough entitled behavior to know it on sight, people who had raised children or been raised poorly and could read the Richard and Derek dynamic in the footage with the accuracy of long personal experience. One comment had over 12,000 likes. It said, she asked him 3 times. 3 times, and each time he chose worse. She closed the laptop and went back to work. Richard Vaughn's attorney called Callahan Motor Works Tuesday morning. Megan answered. She was calm. She took notes. She said, I understand 4 times and I'll pass that along twice. And our documentation has been provided to Officer Cook at the department once. And then she hung up and came to find Ray under a truck. They're claiming emotional distress, Megan said. Ray rolled out from under the truck. Who's Derek's? Apparently the footage has caused him public humiliation. Ray looked at her sister for a long moment. The footage of him publicly humiliating someone caused him public humiliation. That's yes. Essentially, that's what they're claiming. Who filed the emotional distress claim? They haven't filed anything. It's a letter. Megan held it up. Very formal. A lot of words that basically say, back down or we escalate. Ray sat up and took the letter. She read it once, start to finish, without expression. Then she handed it back. Call the attorney on record from our documentation. The one I set up 3 weeks ago. Megan blinked. You already have an attorney. I have documentation and a referral. I've been waiting to need it. 3 weeks ago, Megan said again, slower this time. I knew when Richard called me that first time what kind of man he was. Men like that don't negotiate. They accumulate until someone stops them. Ray wiped her hands on the shop rag. I wanted to be ready before I needed to be ready. Megan stood very still for a moment. Then she said, you are genuinely unnerving sometimes. Dad called it practical. Dad called everything practical. That was how he avoided calling it impressive. Megan folded the letter. I'll make the call. She was back in 45 minutes. Our attorney says the letter is a pressure tactic. No real legal foundation. She also says that given the footage, given the witnesses, given the police report that Officer Cook filed, which apparently is quite thorough, the Vaughns would be taking on significant risk by actually filing anything. Because the footage shows Derek initiating. Because the footage shows Derek initiating every single exchange, and it shows Richard encouraging it, and it shows 30-something witnesses, including a police officer who had an unobstructed view of everything. Megan paused. She also said something else. Ray waited. She said Richard Vaughn is going to feel this in his business before he feels it anywhere else. Because his business reputation is built on reliability and community trust, and he has several contracts with veteran-owned transportation companies, and those companies are watching what's happening. Ray absorbed that without expression. I didn't contact any of his business partners. I know. Nobody did. Megan looked at her phone. The footage did. The first business consequence arrived on Wednesday. A company called Territorial Veterans Freight, a mid-sized operation run by a retired Marine colonel named James Dupree, sent a letter to Vaughn Desert Freight requesting a meeting to review the terms of our partnership arrangement in light of recent public developments. It was written in the careful language of people who want to communicate something serious without providing grounds for legal action, but the meaning was clear enough. Ray knew about it because James Dupree called her directly. She'd met Dupree twice at veteran community events. He was the kind of man who said what he meant and meant what he said and had no patience for either dishonesty or performance. He called from his office on a Wednesday morning, and the first thing he said was, I want you to know I'm not asking for anything from you. Okay, Ray said. I saw the footage. My partner saw it. 3 of our senior drivers saw it. We made a business decision. That decision is ours, not yours. I appreciate that. I also want you to know, Dupree said, that what you did that day, the restraint, the de-escalation, giving that kid more chances than he deserved, that's leadership. I've trained people for 30 years and that was leadership. Ray was quiet for a moment. He's young, she said. He got a bad education about what strength means. A lot of young men do. A pause. The ones who figure it out are worth keeping track of. The ones who don't are worth keeping distance from. Another pause. I'm keeping distance from his father. That's your business decision. It is. Dupree's voice shifted slightly. Warmer. How's your sister? Good. Better than she lets on. Sounds like sisters generally. He hung up. Ray sat at the desk for a moment after the call ended. She hadn't wanted this. Not the footage spreading. Not the business consequences. Not Richard Vaughn's reputation taking damage. She'd wanted 6 weeks of harassment to stop. She'd wanted Megan to feel safe in her own workplace. She'd wanted a fundraiser to run without incident. None of that had been possible on the terms Derek and Richard had imposed. So she'd documented everything, built the case before she needed the case, and trusted that the truth, if it was recorded clearly and witnessed honestly, was capable of speaking for itself. She hadn't called Dupree. She hadn't contacted Richard's partners. She hadn't given interviews or made statements to anyone beyond what Officer Cook required. She had simply let the footage exist and let people draw their own conclusions, because that was what you did when you were confident in what the footage showed. Richard Vaughn had never operated in a world where the footage was honest. He was discovering what that world was like. The twist no one saw coming happened on Thursday. Derek's martial arts instructor, a man named Hector Salinas, who ran a legitimate dojo on the south side of the city and had trained Derek for 6 of his 8 years, posted a statement to the dojo's social media page. It was 3 paragraphs. It didn't use inflammatory language. It didn't attack Derek personally. But what it said landed harder than anything that had come before it. Salinas wrote that he had reviewed the footage in full, that he recognized his students' techniques, and also recognized the context in which they were being used, that a black belt was not a license for aggression, that the philosophy of the discipline he taught was explicitly founded on restraint, on the understanding that trained fighters bore a greater responsibility for de-escalation, not a lesser one, that he was suspending Derek's participation pending a conversation. Then he wrote one more sentence. He wrote, "The woman he confronted demonstrated more of what I teach than he did." The post got shared 11,000 times in 4 hours. Ray found out because Torres texted her a screenshot with nothing else. No message, just the screenshot, which was how Torres communicated things he considered significant. She read it 3 times. Then she called Grizzly. "You saw the Salinas post," Grizzly said when he answered. "I saw it. What do you think?" "I think Salinas is telling the truth, and I think it cost him something to say it publicly." "His student's ego," Grizzly said. "His student's trust," Ray corrected, "which is harder to rebuild than ego." A pause. "You feel sorry for the kid. I feel sorry for what he's about to go through." She leaned against the wall. "He's losing the one identity he had that was completely his. Not his father's money, not his father's name, his belt, his training, the thing he built with his own body over 8 years. She paused. "That's going to hurt in ways he doesn't have language for yet." Grizzly was quiet for a moment. "You know what's interesting," he said, "is that you're more worried about what happens to Derek Vaughn than you are about what Richard Vaughn is doing to your business. Richard Vaughn can't actually damage my business. My business is built on relationships, and those relationships existed long before he showed up." She pushed off the wall. "Derek Vaughn is 23 years old with a crumbling identity and a father who's going to react to business losses by doubling down on the narrative that none of it is his fault. That's a person at a crossroads. Most people at crossroads pick the easier road." "Most people," Ray agreed. "What makes you think he's different?" She thought about the parking lot, the car door opening after 4 minutes of sitting, the bottle of water, Cass talking, Derek's face when she'd asked him whether his training was his or his father's, and the specific quality of the silence that followed, not defensive, not calculating, just genuinely not knowing. "He came back alone," she said. "His father didn't come back. His friends didn't come back. He came back alone, and he sat in that car for 4 minutes deciding whether to get out, and he got out." She paused. "People who are completely decided don't sit for 4 minutes." Grizzly made the sound. "You think too much. You think too little." "That's possibly true." He paused. "Cass liked him. Cass likes most people once they stop performing." "Derek stopped performing?" "For about 45 minutes. Ray picked up her shop rag. It's a start. Richard Vaughn appeared at Callahan Motor Works on Friday afternoon. He came alone. Without his attorney, without Derek, without the armor of his SUV, he drove a regular sedan this time, which Megan noticed immediately and mentioned to Ray in a text from the front window. He came in something normal. That means something. Ray put down her wrench and went to meet him. He was standing in the lot with his hands in his pockets. Not the posture of authority he'd carried on Saturday. Something that was working harder to look calm than calm actually looks. "Miss Callahan," he said. "Mr. Vaughn, I'd like to talk, all right." He looked around the lot. At the garage. At the sign. At the security camera he'd noticed too late on Saturday. "You've been here a long time," he said. 14 years. Your father built it. He started it. We built it. He nodded slowly. The calculation in his face was still there, but it was running a different kind of math than it had been running Saturday. The confidence had been replaced by something more careful. Not humble Richard Vaughn was not a humble man, and no single week of consequences was going to change the deep architecture of who he was. But careful. The kind of careful that comes from discovering that the terrain you're operating on is different than the map you brought. "Territorial Veterans Freight terminated their contract with us yesterday," he said. Ray didn't say anything. "Two other partners have requested reviews." He paused. "I've built Vaughn Desert Freight over 22 years. It's a legitimate operation. It employs 63 people. I'm aware of all of that," Ray said. "Then you understand what's at stake." "I understand what was at stake before Saturday too," she said. "My sister was being harassed. My customers were being targeted. My business was being disrupted deliberately and systematically." She kept her voice even. "I asked you to address it. You told me your son was finding his way." Richard's jaw tightened fractionally. "Derek made poor choices. Derek made the choices you taught him to make," Ray said. "Not cruelly. Not with the intent to wound. With the same directness she used for everything. I don't say that to hurt you. I say it because it's true, and because it's the thing that actually needs to be understood if anything is going to be different. Silence. The kind of silence that lands differently on different people. On Ray, it was comfortable. On Richard, it was visibly uncomfortable. The silence of a man who was used to filling space and had temporarily run out of what to fill it with. "What do you want?" he said finally. The question was stripped of the rhetorical armor he normally wrapped everything in. Just the words. "I want what I wanted 6 weeks ago," Ray said. "No contact. No incidents. Your son stays away from my sister. You pay the outstanding invoice for the mirror repair. And we go back to being two businesses operating in the same area without event. That's it? That's it." He stared at her. "You're not going to pursue anything? Legally? I've filed the police report. That's on record. It stays on record because it should. What anyone else does with the footage is their choice. Not mine." She paused. "I didn't call your partners. Mr. Vaughn, I didn't contact media. I didn't do anything except document what happened and let it be what it was." He looked at her for a long time, long enough that she could see him working through something, not an apology. Richard Vaughn wasn't built for apologies, but something adjacent to the recognition that an apology might eventually be the correct destination, even if he couldn't reach it today. "The mirror invoice," he said. "I'll have it processed today. Thank you." He turned to leave. Stopped. Turned back. "The Salinas statement," he said. "Did you? I've never spoken to Hector Salinas in my life," Ray said. "He made that decision based on what he saw." Richard absorbed that. "Derek's taking it hard. I imagine he is. He won't come out of his room." Richard said it with an expression that was supposed to look like frustration, but underneath it was something rawer and less comfortable. Something that might have been worry, if Richard Vaughn allowed himself to worry about things that couldn't be fixed with money or leverage. Ray looked at the man in front of her, 56 years old, 63 employees, 22 years of building something, and felt the same complicated thing she'd felt thinking about Derek weeks ago. Not sympathy that erased accountability, not forgiveness that arrived before understanding. Just the recognition that the man standing in her parking lot had also, somewhere along the way, learned that admitting weakness was the same as creating it, and that the lesson had cost him things he probably couldn't name. His instructor suspended him, she said carefully, because his instructor holds him to a standard. That's not punishment. That's investment. She paused. If Derek has people in his life who hold him to standards, that's the thing that helps him, not protecting him from the consequences of what he did. Richard was very still. You asked me what I want, Ray said. I want this to be over. But I also want your son to be okay. Not because of what happened between us, because he's 23, and he's at a place where he can still choose differently. She held his gaze. That choice is his, not yours, not mine. Something moved in Richard Vaughn's face that she hadn't seen there before. It passed quickly. He pulled it back before it could fully arrive. But she'd seen it. He left without saying anything else. Megan was at the office window. When Ray came in, Megan had a look on her face that she used when she was reconsidering something she'd previously decided. What did he want, she said. To understand what happened. Did you tell him? Enough of it. Megan looked toward the lot. He's not a good man. No, Ray agreed. But you were decent to him. Yes. Why? Ray sat down across from her sister at the desk. She looked at the donation, total still written on the yellow legal pad. She looked at the invoice folder. She looked at the security camera monitor that showed the empty lot in real time. Because being decent is what I have, she said. It's what I've always had. When I went into that parking lot on Saturday, when he was standing there with his gloves on and 30 people recording, the only thing I actually controlled was who I was going to be in that moment. She picked up her coffee. That's the only thing any of us ever controls. And I wasn't going to let Derek Vaughn or his father take it from me. Megan was quiet for a long moment. Then, the invoice payment came through, by the way. 10 minutes ago. Good. Exact amount. No note. Richard doesn't do notes. No. Megan closed the laptop. Ray. What you said to him about Derek choosing differently. Do you actually believe that? Or is that just the right thing to say? Ray thought about the parking lot, the car door, the 4 minutes, the water bottle. Cass talking. Derek's face when he'd said, I genuinely don't know. Both, she said, which is the only time it's worth saying. 2 weeks after the fundraiser, Hector Salinas called Ray. She almost didn't answer because she didn't recognize the number, and then something made her pick up. Miss Callahan, he said. My name is Hector Salinas. I train Derek Vaughn. I know who you are, she said. I read your statement. I wanted he stopped. Started again. The careful stop and start of someone who prepared what they were going to say and then found it wasn't quite right when they got to the moment. I wanted to say that I'm sorry this happened in my name, that a student I trained behaved that way. That's not your responsibility, Ray said. It's partly my responsibility. I taught him technique. I didn't do enough to make sure he understood what it was for. A pause. Your name came up in our conversation. When I met with him, she waited. He asked me if I'd ever met you, whether I knew you. Salinas paused. I told him I hadn't. He said he needed to ask you something. He can come by the garage, Ray said. A silence. He doesn't think you'd want to see him. Tell him I said he can come by the garage. 3 days later, Derek showed up. He came late afternoon, when the rush had slowed. He parked where he'd always parked badly, taking too much space, and then caught himself and repositioned the car properly before he got out. Ray saw the repositioning from inside. She noted it. He came to the bay door. He was wearing ordinary clothes. No gear. No training gloves tucked under his arm. He looked younger than he had in weeks, which meant he looked closer to 23, which was what he actually was. You said I could come by, he said. I did. She set down what she was working on. What did you need? He stood in the door. He had his hands in his pockets and his weight slightly back, the posture of someone who is ready to leave if the reception calls for it. Selena said you know people, veterans who do training, not tournament stuff. Different, I know some people. He said. Derek stopped. He said if I wanted to actually understand what I've been training, I'd need to be in a room with people who use it differently than I've been using it. That's true. He said, Cal Mercer runs something. Ray looked at him. Grizzly runs a program for veterans and young men referred by the courts or community services. Skills training, self-discipline, mentorship. Some of it's physical. Most of it isn't. She paused. It's not a gym. There are no tournaments. Nobody cares what belt you have. Derek absorbed that. Would he, is that something I can ask him? You'd do that. I said I would. Derek looked at her. He had the expression again, the one without the prepared version. Why, he said. After everything, why would you do that? Ray picked up her work again. Because you repositioned your car before you got out, she said. He blinked. What? You parked too wide. You caught yourself and fixed it. Nobody asked you to. She turned back to the engine. Small things are real things. That was real. Derek stood in the bay door for a moment longer. I'm sorry, he said. For what I said to you, old lady. For the table, for he stopped. For Megan. Mostly for Megan. Megan is the one who needs to hear that, Ray said. Not me. A pause. She'll want to hear it from me? She probably won't want to. But she deserves to. He nodded. Slowly, the nod of someone making a commitment they're not sure they can keep, but intend to try. I'll call Grizzly tonight, Ray said. Come back Thursday. I'll have an answer. Derek turned to leave. Stopped in the bay doorway. That question you asked me, he said. About whether the training was mine or my father. I remember. I've been thinking about it. For 2 weeks, almost every day. He looked at the ground, then up at her. I think it started as his. I think he decided I needed to be formidable. So I trained to be formidable. He paused. But somewhere in the middle of 8 years, I started to actually love it. The discipline of it. There's a moment, right in the middle of sparring, when everything else goes quiet and you're just completely present. Nothing else exists. His voice shifted slightly warmer. I love that moment. That's mine. That was always mine. Ray looked at him. He stopped. I forgot that was what it was for. And I started using it for something else instead. She didn't say anything for a moment. Just looked at him, the way her father had looked at people when they said something true, not evaluating it, just receiving it. Hold on to that, she said finally. The quiet, the presence. That's the part worth keeping. He left. Megan came from the front office 10 minutes later. She'd been listening from the doorway. She didn't ask Ray whether she'd heard. She just came and stood beside her at the workbench. He's going to apologize to me, Megan said. Yes. I'm not ready to accept it. You don't have to be. Ray handed her a wrench without looking. Hold this. Megan held the wrench. But eventually she said, in the tone of someone working something out in real time, eventually I might. That's yours, Ray said. Same as the training was his. The garage smelled like oil and metal, and the specific warmth of work that mattered. Outside, a car was pulling into the lot, a customer, the late afternoon kind who always came, hoping they'd get in before closing, and usually did because Ray almost never turned away someone who needed help. The regular machinery of their life was still running. It had kept running through everything. That, Ray thought, was itself a kind of answer to every question the last 3 weeks had tried to ask. Grizzly said yes on the first ask. Ray called him Thursday morning, the way she'd told Derek she would. And before she'd finished explaining what Derek was asking for, Grizzly made the sound, the approximate laugh, and said, I know why you're calling. He asked about the program. Cass told me he might. Ray paused. Cass talked to him again? Cass has been texting him since the fundraiser. A pause. Don't look surprised. Cass talks to everybody who stops performing. You said that yourself. I didn't think it applied at that speed. Cass has his own timeline. Grizzly's voice shifted slightly. He's doing better, by the way. Cass. Whatever happened that afternoon talking to the Vaughn kid, having something to explain to someone who didn't already know it did something for him. Gave him a direction for a few hours. Ray absorbed that. That's good. It is. A pause. Tell Derek to show up Saturday morning. 6:30, not 6:45, not 6:32. 6:30. I'll tell him. And tell him to leave the belt at home. Not the skill, the belt. The identity that comes with it. That stays outside. He's not going to love hearing that. He doesn't have to love it, Grizzly said. He has to do it. Those are different requirements. Ray told Derek that afternoon. He came by the garage the way she'd asked, stood in the bay door the way he had 3 days before, listened to the conditions. When she got to the part about the belt, the identity, not the skill. His jaw tightened for exactly 2 seconds. Then it released. Okay, he said. Just that. No argument, no negotiation, no asking whether there were exceptions. Ray noted the 2 seconds and the release that followed. The 2 seconds were honest. The release was growth. Both of them together were more promising than either one alone. 6:30, she said. Not 6:32, he almost smiled. Grizzly said that, didn't he? Word for word. Derek looked at the floor for a moment. Will you? He stopped. Never mind. Ask it. He looked up. Will you tell me if he thinks I'm wasting everyone's time? If I'm not, if it's not working, I'd rather know from you than find out a different way. Ray looked at him. The question was genuine. It was the question of someone who had spent years performing for audiences and was now tentatively, uncertainly, trying to understand how to receive honest feedback from a single source instead. Yes, she said, I'll tell you. He nodded. He left. He parked correctly on the way out, without thinking about it, which meant it was starting to be the default rather than the correction. The apology to Megan happened the following week. Ray wasn't there for it. She made sure she wasn't there for it because an apology offered in front of a witness who has standing in the situation is always performing for the witness, even when the person apologizing doesn't intend it. She told Megan that Derek had asked to speak to her. She told Megan it was entirely her choice. She said it once and didn't repeat it, and went into the garage and turned on the radio loud enough to make accidental eavesdropping impossible. Megan came in 40 minutes later. She sat on the stool. She didn't say anything for a moment. Ray turned the radio down. You okay? He cried, Megan said. Ray waited, not dramatically, not performing it. He was explaining what he understood now about what he'd done, and specifically about the arm thing, grabbing my arm when I was trying to walk away. Megan's voice was controlled, but her hands were doing the thing they did. He said he understood now that it didn't matter, that he hadn't intended to scare me. He said the relevant thing was what it felt like from where I was standing, not from where he was standing. She paused. And then his face did something, and he said he was sorry, and he meant it. Ray didn't say anything. I told him I wasn't ready to forgive him, Megan continued. I told him that an apology was real, and I heard it and I appreciated it, but forgiveness was something that happened on my schedule and not his, and he didn't get to need it from me on a timeline that made him feel better. What did he say? He said, that's fair. I don't need you to forgive me. I just needed you to know that I know. Megan paused. And then he asked if he could replace the donation table that he shoved. The physical table. Ray blinked. The table. He wants to buy us a new folding table for events. Megan made a sound that was trying to be a laugh and mostly succeeding. I told him the table was fine. It wasn't damaged. He said he wanted to replace it anyway. He said he wanted there to be a physical thing that was better because of him instead of worse. Ray looked at her sister for a long moment. What did you say? I said we'd accept the table. Megan pressed her lips together because some gestures are worth accepting, not because they erase anything, because they're evidence that something is trying to be different. Ray nodded. I'm not ready to trust him, Megan said clearly. I want to say that out loud. I'm not there. You don't have to be. But she stopped. Try it again. I'm not going to need him to fail anymore. I was, a little. After the fundraiser, part of me wanted him to prove that the apology was false, that nothing had changed, that I'd been right to write him off entirely. She looked at her hands. I don't need that anymore. I'm willing to be wrong about him. She looked up. That's the most I've got. That's a lot, Ray said quietly. That's actually a lot, Megan. Megan smoothed her sleeve. Don't make it a thing. I'm not making it a thing. Your face is making it a thing. Ray turned back to the engine. Go answer the phones. Megan stood up from the stool and walked toward the office and then stopped in the doorway. A table, she said again, mostly to herself. He wants to give us a table. It's a good gesture. It's a very specific gesture. Most people would bring flowers or something vague. Megan shook her head. He thought about what the actual damage was and tried to address the actual damage. Yes, Salinas is a good teacher. He is. So are you, Megan said. And then she went to answer the phones before Ray could respond, which was almost certainly intentional. The program with Grizzly was not what Derek had expected. He told Ray that the second Saturday, when he stopped by the garage on his way back from the morning session, he stood in the bay doorway. It was becoming his spot. That doorway, the place where he stood when he wanted to say something real without committing fully to the room, and he said, "It's not what I thought it was going to be." "What did you think it was going to be?" "More physical, more like training." He rubbed the back of his neck. "The first thing Grizzly made us do was clean the equipment. All of it. Every pad, every glove, every mat edge. On our hands and knees with rags." He paused. "There were 4 of us. 3 veterans and me. Nobody told us why we were cleaning. Nobody explained what it was teaching." "Did you ask?" "After about 20 minutes, yeah. I asked Grizzly why we were doing this instead of training." "What did he say?" Derek looked at the floor. "Then up," he said. "This is training. The rest is exercise." Ray kept her hands on the engine. She didn't look up. She trusted her voice more than her face in this moment. "And you understood that." "I didn't understand it then. I'm starting to understand it now." A pause. "There's a veteran there. Nam. Vietnamese American, 68 years old. 3 tours. He doesn't say much during sessions. But afterward, when everyone's cleaning up, he talks. And the things he says," Derek stopped. "He talks about what discipline actually costs. Not what you gain from it. What it costs. What you give up to have it. The version of yourself you don't get to be anymore once you commit to something higher." Ray looked up now. Derek had his jaw set the way he did when something had gotten past his defenses, and he was deciding whether to acknowledge it or cover it. He decided to acknowledge it. "I've been thinking about my dad," he said. She waited. Not angry thinking, just thinking. "About what he taught me, what he intended to teach me versus what I actually learned." His voice was careful, the way voices get when the speaker is building something in real time and doesn't want to knock it over. "He wanted me to be strong. That was real. He genuinely wanted that for me. But the only version of strong he could show me was the version where you never let anyone see that anything costs you anything." Ray nodded slowly. "Nam's the strongest person I've ever been in a room with," Derek said. "And he talks about cost all the time. He talks about how much things hurt and what he lost, what he'd give to have it back. He doesn't cover any of it." A pause. "That's not weakness. That's something else entirely." "Yes," Ray said. "It is." Derek looked at his hands. "My dad's not a bad person. I want to say that. He's not a villain. He learned something wrong a long time ago, and he's been teaching it ever since because it's the only thing he knows." He paused. "And I've been letting him." Ray set down her wrench. She wiped her hands and looked at him fully. "What are you going to do with that?" "I don't know yet. Honest. No performance. I know I can't fix him. I know I can't go home and explain all of this and have him suddenly become different. That's not how it works." "No," Ray agreed, "it isn't. But I can," he stopped. "I can stop letting his version of strength be the voice in my head when I'm deciding how to act." He looked up. "Does that make sense?" "More sense than most things people say to me," Ray said. He almost smiled. It reached his eyes this time. "Grizzly said you'd know what I meant. Grizzly talks too much." "He talks exactly enough," Derek said. "That's actually one of the things I'm learning." He left. He parked correctly. He waved at Megan through the front window, a small wave, uncertain, not pushing for a response. Megan lifted one hand briefly. Not a wave back exactly. An acknowledgement. The beginning of the geography of people who are not enemies and not yet anything else, feeling their way across unfamiliar ground. It was enough. For now, it was enough. Richard Vaughn's business took 3 more weeks to fully register what had happened. The second partner review concluded with a contract reduction, not termination, but a significant scaling back that removed Vaughn Desert Freight from 2 of the larger regional routes. A third company, a smaller operation run by a woman named Sandra Chu, who had been supplying Vaughn Desert Freight with last-mile delivery services for 4 years, simply stopped returning Richard's calls. She didn't send a letter. She didn't make a statement. She just went quiet. And Richard Vaughn's operation discovered that silence could cost as much as noise. 63 employees. Richard was not unaware of the weight of that number. He had not built Vaughn Desert Freight to watch it contract. He was not the kind of man who absorbed loss quietly or processed consequence without externalizing it. And for the first 2 weeks after the fundraiser, he had done what he always did with discomfort. He'd pushed it outward. He'd called attorneys. He'd leaned on city contacts. He'd had 3 conversations with people who owed him favors and spent those favors trying to shift a narrative that had already, conclusively, been recorded. None of it worked the way it was supposed to. The footage existed. It was clear. And the specific cruelty of honest footage in an era of universal recording was that it didn't care about the story you wanted to tell. It just showed what happened. Richard Vaughn sat in his office on a Tuesday evening in the 4th week after the fundraiser, and for the first time in longer than he could clearly remember, he sat with something he couldn't fix. He hadn't told anyone this. He would never tell anyone this. But he sat there with the weight of it, the contracts, the silence from Sandra Chu, the Selena statement that was still circulating, Derek's face across the dinner table every evening saying nothing in a way that communicated everything. And he felt something he didn't have ready vocabulary for because he'd spent decades ensuring he'd never need it. He felt like he'd made a mistake. Not the specific mistake of encouraging Derek in the parking lot, though that was part of it. The deeper mistake, the one that had taken 23 years to produce the specific outcome of his son coming home from a fundraiser, changed in some way that Richard couldn't name and didn't fully understand and wasn't sure he was equipped to follow. He picked up his phone. He put it back down. He sat for a long time. He did not call Ray Callahan. That was not who Richard Vaughn was. And one evening of sitting with consequence was not sufficient to make him someone different. But he sat. He let it be what it was. And in the sitting, somewhere beneath all the calculation and the armor and the decades of practiced imperviousness, something cracked along a very old seam and let a small amount of something honest through. He didn't tell anyone, but it happened. And the things that happen in private, even the ones that never get spoken, have a way of showing up eventually in how a person moves through the world. Not dramatically, not as transformation, just as a slight adjustment in the angle of approach. A fraction of a degree that, over enough distance, becomes a different direction entirely. The second fundraiser happened 4 months after the first. Not the annual one. Ray had organized a smaller mid-year event, a one afternoon gathering for 3 veteran families who'd hit particularly hard patches in the fall. Smaller than the big one. Folding tables, donated food, a raffle with 2 prizes. The new table that Derek had delivered, a proper commercial-grade folding table with reinforced legs, significantly nicer than the one it replaced, assembled and positioned by Derek himself on a Tuesday morning while Megan watched from the window and didn't come outside, which was fine, which was where they were, and fine was sufficient. The day before the small fundraiser, Ray's phone rang. It was Hector Salinas. "I wanted to let you know," he said, "that I've reinstated Derek." Ray set down her coffee. "How is he?" "Different." A pause. "Not finished. Not fixed. I want to be clear about that. He's still 23, and he still has a father who is who he is, and those are not small things to work through." Another pause. "But he's training differently. He's present in a way he wasn't before. He asks questions now, instead of performing answers." Salinas paused again. "He asked me last week why I teach. Not what I teach. Why? What did you tell him?" "I told him because the discipline changed me, and I wanted to give that to other people." A pause. He thought about that for a long time. Then he said, "I think I've been using it to avoid being changed." Salinas' voice shifted. "That's not a 23-year-old's insight. That's older than that. He's been spending time with Nam," Ray said. "I know, Nam told me." A pause. "Nam doesn't tell me things about many people." Ray was quiet for a moment. "Thank you for calling. Thank you for asking Grizzly to include him." Salinas paused. "You didn't have to do that. After everything." "I know." "Why did you?" Ray thought about it. She thought about her father and the garage, and 14 years of building something that mattered. She thought about Megan and the yellow legal pad and the donation total and the specific kind of community that shows up when you give it something worth showing up for. She thought about Cass on the cooler with his plate and 32 engines shutting down in sequence and the silence that followed. Because decent is the default, she said. I've said that a few times lately. Salinas laughed. A real one. I'm going to use that with my students. Go ahead. The morning of the small fundraiser, Derek arrived at 6:15, not 6:30. Earlier. He came in the side entrance, the one the volunteers used, not the main parking entrance that customers used. He was wearing work clothes, old jeans, a faded shirt, boots that had clearly been used for actual work. He had a box in his arms. Megan was already there, setting up the registration table. She looked up when he came in. He looked at her. He didn't push for a greeting. He just held up the box slightly and said, "Where do you want these?" "What's in it?" "Supplies. Paper goods, pens, a backup extension cord." "Cass said you always run out of pens." Megan looked at the box. Then at Derek. "Over there," she said, left of the main table. He took the box to where she'd pointed and began unpacking it without fanfare, without making it a performance, without looking to see if anyone was watching. He had 3 more trips from his car before the first other volunteers arrived. He stacked folding chairs. He helped Torres run the power strip for the speaker system. He did the things that needed doing without waiting to be asked to do them. Ray watched from the garage doorway. She was not watching with the sentimental attention of someone waiting for a transformation moment. She was watching with the practical attention of someone assessing whether the change she'd begun to observe was real or situational, whether it held up under ordinary conditions, without an audience, without a dramatic context to sustain it. It held up. He wasn't performing good behavior. He was just behaving. That was the difference. That was the whole difference. Grizzly arrived at 7:30 with 6 riders. They pulled in without the formation. This time, just individual arrivals, people coming to help, not an entrance. Cass was among them. He went directly to where Derek was working, and they shook hands and then stood talking for a moment before Grizzly pointed them both toward the grill setup, and they went. Ray walked over to Grizzly. He looked at Derek and Cass at the grill and then at Ray, and then he didn't say anything, which, from Grizzly, was its own complete statement. "He's doing the work," Ray said. "He is." Grizzly crossed his arms. "It's the quiet work that counts. Anyone can show up for the dramatic version. The quiet version is what tells you who somebody is." He repositioned his car the day he came to ask about the program. Grizzly looked at her. "That's what did it for you. That's what told me it was worth asking." Grizzly shook his head slowly. "You and the small things. Small things are real things," she said. "You know that. I know it. I just don't always say it as neatly." He looked at the grill. "The dad's quieted down. He has. Not changed. Quieted down." "I know the difference," Ray said. "I know you do." Grizzly paused. "You think he'll ever actually get there? Richard?" Ray thought about the man who'd shown up alone in a regular sedan. She thought about his face when she'd told him that Derek's choices were Derek's, not his. She thought about the invoice paid without a note. Exact amount, same day. "I think he cracked," she said. "Whether he lets anything through the crack is his choice." She paused. "I can't want it more than he does." "Can't want it more than he does," Grizzly repeated. "That's a good way to live. It's the only way to live without wearing yourself out." Mid-morning, between the first rush and the second, Ray was at the workbench in the garage. When she heard footsteps, she recognized by now the specific cadence of someone who'd learned to come without announcing themselves. Derek stood in the doorway. "You need something?" she said. "No." He paused. "I wanted to ask you something." "Ask." He came a step inside. He had grease on his hands from helping Torres with the speaker cable, and he'd wiped most of it off on his jeans without thinking about it, which was the behavior of someone who'd stopped treating their appearance as a signal. "Nam said something to me this week," he said. "He said that real strength isn't what you can do to other people. It's what you can hold back from doing when you have the ability and the reason and the audience." He paused. He said most people spend their whole lives never having that tested in a real way. Another pause. He said you've had it tested more than once. Ray set down her tool. She looked at Derek and saw something she hadn't seen in the parking lot on that Saturday, a young man who was asking because he wanted to understand, not because he wanted to be confirmed. He's right, she said. It gets tested. How do you hold it? What? The restraint. When everything in you wants to when you could, and the other person deserves it, and everyone watching would understand, how do you hold it? Ray was quiet for a moment. She thought about Saturday. She thought about the way she'd felt in that parking lot, not fearless, not cold, not the mythologized version that the footage had turned her into in the comments section of a video she'd watched once and never returned to. She thought about what it had actually felt like, the heat of it, the way her hands had known what to do because they'd done it before, in places far harder than a charity parking lot. The specific effort of choosing restraint, not because she was incapable of the alternative, but because she was capable of something better. I ask myself who I want to be when it's over, she said. Not while it's happening. It's too loud while it's happening. But I asked myself that question enough times before I was ever tested that by the time the testing came, the answer was already in place. Derek absorbed that. You practiced it. I practiced it. She picked up her tool again. The same way you practiced combinations until they were automatic. I practiced the question until the answer was automatic. He stood with that for a long moment. What's the answer? The answer is myself, she said simply. I want to still be myself when it's over. Intact. Not borrowed. Not bent into the shape the other person needed me to be. She looked at him. That's the whole answer. It's a short answer, but it takes a long time to really have it. Derek nodded. The slow nod of someone making something part of themselves rather than just storing it as information. Thank you, he said. And then, because he was learning to leave before the moment became something to perform, I'm going to go help Cass overcook the burgers. Tell Grizzly they're good. He paused. Are they good? They're always a little overcooked. Then why? Because he means well and it costs nothing, Ray said. Go, he went. By 2 p.m, the small fundraiser had raised more than Ray had projected. Megan counted it twice at the table, wrote the number with the careful deliberateness of someone who didn't want to misrepresent something good, and then held up the pad so Ray could see it from across the lot. Ray gave her a nod. Megan gave her one back. That was its own language. 38 years of it, worn smooth and fast and completely sufficient. The Hells Angles crew began their cleanup at 2:30. They were efficient and thorough, and they didn't leave until the lot was cleaner than it had been when they arrived, which was the standard Grizzly had set years ago and enforced without drama. Derek worked alongside Cass and 2 other riders without distinguishing himself from them. In any visible way, no special effort, no visible need for notice, just present and useful and occupied with the task. At 3 o'clock, with the tables folded and the supplies loaded and the last of the vehicles pulling out, Grizzly walked over to where Derek was coiling the extension cord near the garage wall. He stood beside him, looked at the cord, looked at the lot, looked at Derek's grease-stained hands. Still need everybody knowing you're a black belt? Grizzly said. Derek looked at his hands. He looked at the lot. He looked at where Megan and Ray were standing by the main table, talking to the last 2 attendees, ordinary and unhurried and fully themselves. He gave the small smile, the real one, not the performance. Not really, he said. Grizzly reached into the truck bed beside him and lifted out another box. Handed it to Derek. Good, he said. Carry this. Derek took the box and carried it without a word and without looking to see who was watching. Ray saw it anyway. She saw it from across the lot, and she didn't make it a moment, and she didn't say anything to Megan about it, because some things were complete without being named. She turned back to the conversation she was having and let it be what it was, a small, true thing that had happened in ordinary daylight, unremarkable to everyone who hadn't been tracking the distance between where Derek Vaughn had started and where he was standing now. Later, after everyone had gone and the lot was quiet and Torres had locked up and Megan had gone home, Ray sat at the workbench with her cold coffee and the parts catalog she didn't need. She was thinking about her father. She was thinking about the garage, the thing he'd started, and the thing she and Megan had built from it. She was thinking about 14 years of mornings that felt ordinary while they were happening and significant in retrospect. She was thinking about the specific kind of strength that doesn't announce itself, that doesn't require an audience, that exists in the gap between what you could do and what you choose to do, and holds that gap steady even when it costs you something. Her phone buzzed. A text from Cass, Nam, says hi. He wants you to know he thinks you're the real thing. She looked at it for a moment. Typed back, tell him same. She set the phone down and finished the cold coffee and turned off the workbench light. Outside, the Arizona sky was doing what it did in late afternoon burning amber, long shadows, the particular quality of light that made everything in the desert look both ancient and immediate. Like the landscape was reminding you that it had witnessed longer stories than yours and found them all equally worth the attention. Ray locked the garage and walked to her truck and pulled out onto the desert road. She rode for a while alone. The road opened up the way roads do when the town falls behind and the sky comes all the way down to the horizon, and the engine underneath her was smooth and honest and asking nothing but what it was built for. She thought about the Saturday that had started all of this. She thought about the young man who had stood in her parking lot with his training gloves and his audience and his absolute certainty that she was something he could define. She thought about the moment the engines came around the bend and his smile disappeared. She thought about offering her hand and the look on his face when his father called him away before he could take it. She thought about the hand he would eventually take, not from her, from himself. From the version of himself that was slowly, imperfectly, without any guarantee of outcome, choosing something different than what he'd been taught. You couldn't want it more than he did. She knew that. But you could be the person who showed him what it looked like to be intact, to be complete, to move through the world without needing to diminish someone else in order to feel tall. She had done that. Nothing more and nothing less. Ray Callahan rode beneath the enormous Arizona sky with the wind in her face and Callahan Motor Works disappearing in the mirror behind her. And she felt what she always felt on the open road, that the world was large enough to hold everything that had happened and everything that was going to happen, and that she was exactly the right size for her place in it. For years, people had looked at the quiet, blonde mechanic with the grease on her shirt and the calm in her eyes and mistaken the quiet for absence, mistaken the calm for emptiness, mistaken the restraint for limitation. Derek Vaughn had made that mistake in front of 32 witnesses and 300,000 strangers and one police report and a social media post from an honest instructor and a veteran named Nam who talked about cost. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, without drama and without a clean ending and without the kind of transformation that happens in a single moment, he had begun to learn what the quiet actually was. It wasn't absence. It was everything. Ray rode until the road curved and the light changed and the desert opened into the long, flat stretch that felt like the beginning of something rather than the end, and she rode into it without hesitation because that was what she had always done, and it had always been enough, and it always would be. The mistake once made stays made. But the person you are on the other side of it, that part is still being written. And Ray Callahan had always known how to hold a pen.